Hello and welcome to Archvaldor's Hacks with Archvaldor and his amazing hacks. Today I'm going to show you how to break into one of Blizzard's forbidden areas, one of the most spectacular and interesting. Previously, exploration techniques to get out of bounds required a lot of setup and expertise, but recently it has become very easy, as we'll see here. The area we will be exploring is Stratholme, one of WoW's legendary instances. Veteran explorers note that there is a very interesting change that's taken place here relatively recently. I recommend you create a Mage Alliance Void Elf for this, for reasons which will become clear. Void Elves start at level 10, which means they can skyride instantly. It only takes a few minutes to fly from Stormwind right up to Stratholme in the far north of the Eastern Kingdoms. So when we get to Stratholme, we want to get inside the dungeon without actually getting inside the dungeon. For new players, I should just briefly explain that when we enter a dungeon portal like this, we leave the open world and enter a separate part of the game architecture, where only the dungeon and its surrounding scenery exists. That's called an instance. What we can actually see of the dungeon when we are in the open world is called the Uninstanced dungeon, or in this case, Uninstanced Stratholme. At level 10, our Void Elf is too low level to enter the Stratholme dungeon. Consequently, they can just walk through the portal without getting transported into the dungeon. Now, Blizzard have put additional barriers in the way, 2 invisible walls. The first can be bypassed easily with the mage's blink ability. As blink is a teleport ability, it often bypasses collision detection with invisible walls in older instances. You can just wait for blink to come off cooldown and use it again to get past the second invisible wall, but Void Elves have a racial ability called Spatial Rift, which does much the same thing as blink and can get you past the second wall straight away. Note this is a much faster way to get into secret uninstanced Stratholme than using methods in any previous expansion, which tended to be slower and or require more expertise. Once inside, you can see this incarnation of Stratholme is entirely empty. There are no mobs at all inside. One of the first things, and this will surprise veteran explorers who haven't been here recently, is this magical blue void shroud that you will encounter persistently as you go through Uninstanced Stratholme. It will become clear what it is in due course. Now we are going to head on to Crusaders Square, and you get the first indication that you are in Uninstanced Stratholme as you head into Crusaders Square, and the terrain from the open world bisects the dungeon. Watch it again in slow motion. Now when we head into the Scarlet Bastion, you get the first major glitch you'll encounter here. When we get to this point, our character just turns completely invisible. This is because of the peculiar way Stratholme was just put down on top of the open world and doesn't really fit the surrounding terrain. And there's no reason to make it fit because no one was ever supposed to come here. So where the open world meets the dungeon, you get these weird effects. Note also that the zone changes to Kel'Thuzad mysteriously. More on that in a second. That's as far as we can go in that direction. So we're going to turn around and head back to the start and then head towards the service entrance. As you go through here, as if by magic, a portcullis spawns behind and in front of you out of nowhere. I'm not entirely sure why this happens. It doesn't seem to be anything to do with the weird rendering and isn't present in the actual dungeon itself. As I said, there are no NPCs in this dungeon, which is basically true, but you'll notice these charred corpses scattered around. Now, look what happens here. If you go to the right of the chapel, you'll see the portcullis that used to be where you would enter service entrance Stratholme. This is actually no longer used in the actual dungeon. If you hover your cursor over the portcullis, you'll see the label Doodad Small Portcullis in the bottom right of the screen, presumably a developer label which was changed for the final dungeon instance. You can lift the portcullis and go through it, but you get blocked off as the dungeon morphs into the outside terrain. We are going to continue on past the ziggurats, and eventually we reach the slaughterhouse, the area where we normally fight the dungeon boss Baron Rivendare. That was in Classic, or now his son Lord Aureus Rivendare. The slaughterhouse itself cannot be entered, as there is some kind of invisible barrier, but there's actually nothing to look at there anyway. However, if we go off to the portcullis on the side, we come across this distinctive green instance portal. This was intended to be where the original entrance to Naxxramas back in vanilla was, but it was never actually implemented, though it was left here afterwards and has never been removed. If we go through the portal, you can see this untextured version of Naxxramas in the sky, one of the most spectacular forbidden assets in all of Warcraft's hidden areas. Now, there's a way out here, straight through the northern wall, and you'll get this fascinating, surreal view of the necropolis, with these half-formed ruined buildings on fire stretched out across the skyline. There's just one more thing to discover, and that's where the void energy is coming from. Note that this wasn't in Uninstanced Stratholme until very recently. Older viewers and explorers will know what it is already. It is the original open-world version of a Kel'Thuzad zone that predates the Kel'Thuzad proper zone introduced in Burning Crusade. It is basically just a collection of Night Elf buildings, notably this tower. For some reason, Blizzard decided to introduce this void energy effect in this normally inaccessible zone a couple of years ago. Presumably this was something to do with the relatively recent void-themed storylines from Legion onwards, but no one knows exactly why. If you want to know more about this, I made a specific video about it a few years back. But this isn't the end of the story, for while we've fairly thoroughly explored Uninstanced Stratholme, we've yet to explore the boundaries of the Instanced dungeon itself. Breaking out of the Instanced dungeon is even easier than the Uninstanced dungeon, and it has its own magical secrets to discover. To break out, jump onto the stone wall on the left of the main entrance, and then hug the wall around as you exit the Instance portal. Then double back to avoid a teleport field which will send you back to the main dungeon. There are many more magical secrets to discover here. But that, my dear children, is another story for another day. If you have a passion for glitches and exploits, then consider subscribing, and also if you really want to see where this bunny hole goes, then check out my Patreon.